Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, from across the JCU community and beyond. I would like to welcome you to the third session of our Conversations with Alumni series. My name is Jack Rowden, and I'm the Alumni Relations and Development Coordinator at James Cook University, and I host these panel sessions once a month, featuring some of our amazing alumni and discussions about the most pressing matters of our time. I truly look forward to moderating this webinar. However, before we continue, I wish to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this country and pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders, past and present, of the land on which JCU conducts its business. In the spirit of reconciliation, I also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to make to James Cook University and the broader community. Well, to all of our alumni in the audience, thank you so much for joining us. I was looking through our list of registrants earlier today, and I was delighted to see people who are going to tune in from over 30 countries, which really highlights the global span of our alumni community. On our last session, which was the second in this series, we were joined by alumni in 39 countries, from the Pacific Islands to Congo and even the Arctic Circle. And much like last month, we certainly have a global audience befitting a global topic tonight, as we will be exploring how societies and individuals can adapt to a rapidly changing human experience, increasingly lived alongside and amongst forms of artificial intelligence. Now, our Conversations with Alumni series is all about discussing the most pressing matters of our time, and there is no doubt that the age of artificial intelligence is one of the most punctuating moments in history, which we all get to witness firsthand. To provide some critical insights into how our species will navigate this mesmerizing chapter of the human narrative, I am thrilled to be joined by a very astute and experienced panel, which we are honored to have comprising three of our most distinguished alumni, including our university's Chancellor. As an alumnus of JCU myself, I really am proud to count myself amongst the same group as the esteemed panelists who join us all this evening. So, firstly, I'm delighted to introduce one of James Cook University's leading academics, Professor Ian Atkinson, who completed all of his undergraduate, honours and postgraduate study with JCU, culminating in him graduating with a PhD in chemistry and biochemistry in 1993. Shifting his academic focus away from experimental science into computational chemistry and high-performance computing, Ian now serves as director of the JCU eResearch Centre. He is actively involved in researching how new systems and software connect the physical and virtual worlds. Ian brings research experience in sensor networks, the Internet of Things, and big data analytics to the discussion, and we're thrilled to have him joining us this evening. So Ian, thank you very much for your time and welcome.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you very much for the honour, and hello out there to all the alumni. It's great to see you virtually.
Excellent, excellent. And next, we are truly privileged to have Andrea Della Mattea, the President of Microsoft Asia Pacific, joining us from Singapore. Andrea is genuinely one of our most distinguished alumni, as highlighted by her being named as one of JCU's inaugural crop of outstanding alumni in 2010. Graduating in 1993 with first-class honours in a Bachelor of Engineering, Andrea has spent almost her entire career in senior management positions for Software Spectrum, Insight, and of course, Microsoft. Andrea has oversight over 2,000 staff at Microsoft, the university-recognised tech giant who are at the forefront of both the AI and the IoT revolutions. So welcome, Andrea. We're thrilled to have you join us this evening for this conversation.
Thanks, Jack. Really pleased to be here and echo that welcome to all of the alumni who've joined us today as well.
Fantastic. And finally, we are pleased to welcome back to our Conversations with Alumni series our Chancellor, Mr. Bill Tweddell, who graduated from James Cook University with a Bachelor of Arts in 1972 and a Bachelor of Economics in 1976, before enjoying a long career in Australia's diplomatic service, holding roles such as the Ambassador to the Philippines, the Ambassador to Vietnam, and various other high-profile positions. Bill was one of our inaugural outstanding alumni in 2010 and is the first alumnus to serve as the Chancellor of the University. So welcome, Bill. We're thrilled to have you on board in our first Conversations Alumni session. So thank you so much for joining us again. And I believe you have a few words of welcome for your fellow panelists.
Yes, thank you very much, Jack, and good evening, Ian, Andrea, and to all those who have tuned in tonight. It's a great honour to be, as Jack just mentioned, the first alumnus to serve as Chancellor of our university, and to count myself among the something like 90,000 JCU alumni from over 100 countries. My appreciation also, Jack, through you, to the many people who are responsible for conceiving and bringing to fruition this excellent alumni conversation series. It's great to be part of that. And it was terrific to be a panelist in the first event in the series last month on the topic of leadership, diplomacy, and compassion in a restless world. That was, of course, a subject that was close to my career experience and involved subject areas on which I could claim at least some modest degree of expertise. Tonight's topic, by contrast, is an area of great interest to me, but on which I can make no claim either to expertise or to experience. So I'm really looking forward very much indeed to learning more through engaging with and tapping into the undoubted expertise of our two JCU esteemed alumni and fellow panelists, Ian and Andrea. Ian's without doubt one of our tropical leaders, and we are so fortunate to have him on our staff here at JCU. It's terrific also to see Andrea again. Among other things, Andrea serves our university as a member of the JCU Singapore Advisory Board, where I'm well placed to say she makes an excellent contribution. The first time Andrea and I saw each other was in 2010, when we were both, as you've heard, recognising the inaugural crop of JCU alumni, outstanding alumni. I have to say, I thought I'd probably walked into the wrong room that night when I found myself in the company of people like Andrea. So I'm looking forward to the night very much, Jack.
Fantastic, Bill. Yeah, I think it's certainly shaping to be a wonderful session. And as you said, we really are so blessed to have such a robust alumni community. So let's get stuck into it. To our audience, should you have any questions that you'd like one of our three panelists to address, please do pop them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we will endeavour to get them answered at some stage, possibly towards the end of the webinar. So without further ado, let's begin. Ian, I might start with you, but I would encourage all of our panelists, of course, to jump in should you have any comments at all throughout the session. Ian, in preparing for this session, I was reading through your research portfolio and I was fascinated to see the broad range of applications of the latest tech innovations which you've witnessed and studied. Would you be able to start off by putting on your teaching hat just briefly and enlighten those of us who still have trouble wrapping our heads around concepts such as artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things? What do they mean? What are they? And perhaps you could point to some of our everyday engagements with these technologies.
Wow, that's a big way to start, isn't it, Jack? And yeah, just to echo Jack, anyone that has questions, please put them in the box, because I love to talk to people about this topic. And every time I do, someone teaches me something by the questions that they ask. So I actually think this is an extraordinary time to be alive. And COVID's amazing, awful, amazing, the recession, all of these things. But if you cast your mind back 9 long months ago, everyone was talking about tech. And I'm sure in 2 years' time, that's what we'll be talking about again, because really, at a macro scale, that's the biggest thing. This is really an inflection point, I think, in human history, where our impact on ourselves, on each other, on the world, maybe even beyond that, is being amplified by technology. It's become a force multiplier for what humans are. They're good and they're bad. Everything is amplified and expanded by it. So, if you think about the topic, everyone talks about AI now, but it's really interesting how this has evolved. It's a very old idea. And actually it came from computer scientists thinking about how they thought the brain might work in the 1940s. They actually tried to mimic the process of a human brain, which was great. So they had, an input, and then they transmitted that to some kind of output that acted upon it. And in the middle, they might just put they might interconnect these things. So they might have a few layers of these things. So the output could talk to maybe some more inputs, and they would put what they call weights on them. So, a little signal might create a big amplified signal, or a big signal might be attenuated. And from that, they could do things, but it didn't get very far. But then there's been gradual evolution, but there's been a few step changes. And I don't know, maybe I've got to remember the date, maybe 2010, something like that. These idea of kind of deeper learning and adversarial models came along with the GAN models. And this is where you could get an AI talking to another AI, and they would start to teach each other. And so the process of teaching these things, which is very slow and laborious and not at all sexy, it might be people in India actually taking images and putting a crossover sun behind you and saying that looks like a sun, and creating this huge, massive data set. But these are, you know, and you could teach these things because layer upon layer, you could actually build up a representation. In about 2015, Microsoft had a long-running competition where you'd present your model with images, and they had to close it down in 2015 because computer vision, if you like, got better than people. We could train it on things, and then we could throw it something it didn't know, and it would do a better job than a person. And that was pretty extraordinary. So it led to this avalanche of outcomes. You know, this is when Google could go from solve the Go problem, where it had kind of maybe, you know, chess maybe had 10 to the 9 combinations. It went to Go, which had something like 10 to the 90 combinations. So you can't brute force it. And then a year later, we solved poker. You know, you could actually have poker playing engines that would defeat professional poker players. And it's because we weren't just brute forcing anything. We were actually kind of learning from each other. But it's not, although we call it deep learning, it's not that deep, really. You know, this isn't like a howl from the, it's not a human intelligence. It's not consciousness. It's not like that. It's just super advanced pattern matching. And it turns out, I think, that humans are actually pretty dumb. You know, most of the time, I don't think we're very conscious. In fact, if you think back on today, how much of the day were you conscious for? How much were you really thinking about deep philosophical problems? And how much time were you just doing them routine and mundane, really running on autopilot? Your limbic nervous system just doing the work for you. Driving's like that. When you learn to drive, it's really hard. When you can drive, it's just on cruise control. And most of the time we're on cruise control. So machines don't need to be that smart to, in some ways, mimic a lot of the things that we do. And so this is why it's now become everywhere. You know, obviously this computer actually has a lot of AI running it. This Zoom call, the image processing behind it to make this thing look smooth, and hopefully you can hear my voice and it's not too bad, because actual neural networks are processing it. These little earpods in them have a super fast microprocessor running a trained neural network that actually gets rid of the echo. Your phones, you know that. You can type, you know, a word cat into your phone, it'll find all the images. That's just this image processing. It seems spooky. I used to think it was witchcraft. But once you know how it works, it's not that hard, actually. It's weird. So, and it fails catastrophically. But our biggest problem, I think, is that we can make this, but we don't understand it, not in a deep way. And there's so much bias. It's showing us how much bias exists in our world. So it kind of emerged with facial recognition that, you know, we were training the facial recognition on the internet. And it was great for white people because it was white people in Silicon Valley doing it, but it didn't do so well on people of color and people of different ethnic groups. We find out that our data sets are full of discrimination against women. Andrea might prompt me, but there was an interesting Microsoft AI that went out to Twitter to learn about Twitter to write tweets. And it turned out that they'd turn it off after a few days because it was just spewing out bile and racism, because that's what it was picking up from Twitter. So it's not smart. It's just this pattern recognition, and maybe our own patterns confront us a bit.
Yeah, look, I think, Ian, you've set the scene absolutely perfectly there for the session, to be perfectly honest. Even things like Google's AlphaZero, I'm going to be asking you a question a little bit more about that later on. So that's great that I got to mention as well. And I think, just like you started off with, we certainly are moving across a mind-blowing and exciting threshold with these latest innovations. And so, Andrea, I'll move on to you now before we do get back to sort of talking about some of the issues that Ian raised a little bit later in the session. One of Microsoft's great achievements in the human historical narrative has been to personalize digital technology and make it approachable and usable for the general public. And this, of course, manifested most profoundly in the transformation of the personal computer with Windows software, I should say. With that in mind, what are some of the most commonly used forms of AI at present? And what types of everyday products can people in the audience expect to see on offer from Microsoft and the other tech giants in the next decade or so?
Thanks, Jack. And thanks, Ian, for that introduction to AI and IoT. And Bill, yes, hard to believe, we did first meet 10 years ago now at that event in Townsville. Look, it's quite widely acknowledged that technology is transforming almost every industry and almost every aspect of society, not only in Australia, but really across other countries as well. And the reality is AI touches some form of our lives, just as Ian was showing you with his Apple Pods, every day, and it might not actually be evident to us. So take social media, which I'm sure all attendees at this event probably access on a daily basis. Have you ever experienced that moment when the advertising in your app, like Instagram, for example, suddenly shows an ad that's exactly what you were looking for? Or maybe when you were watching Netflix or Stan, and the personalized recommendations that you get are different to your partner's or maybe your children's. Or maybe when you read the daily newspaper, like the Sydney Morning Herald's website, that uses AI to serve up articles that you would more likely than not be interested in based upon what you've accessed previously. And even if you think about our cars today, they can show us the fastest, the safest route to get to our destination. Even in our houses, you know, for many of us working from home, products like Roomba cleaning robots, you know, those little self-cleaning vacuum cleaners that use sensors and machine learning to literally map out our rooms and keep our houses clean. Technology is even impacting the beer industry, something I'm sure that near and dear to everyone's hearts on this call. The Carlsberg Research Lab is actually using tech, using AI for the malting, the brewing and the fermenting operations so that the humble beer is at its optimal best for us to consume. And maybe another example that's close to our hearts in Australia, which is sport and cricket in particular. Cricket Australia are trialling an intelligent coaches platform that gives data-driven recommendations on when players need to be rested from games so that they can avoid injury and in turn also ensure optimal performance. And maybe one last example. I'm sure everyone on this call enjoys that morning jolt of caffeine from an espresso or a flat white, whatever it may be. If you think about the coffee machine at your local cafe, that machine has more computing power today than my first desktop ever did at James Cook all those years ago. AI senses the weight of the ground coffee, the size of the grind, to make decisions on the temperature and the amount of water for that perfect espresso. Look, needless to say, AI is all around us in our everyday life. So when we look to the future, we expect that AI will be even further infused with the natural world around us, making our lives easier, but as well being used to try to solve some of the world's greatest challenges responsibly. You know, technology shouldn't suppress creativity. In fact, technology should enhance creativity. And the difference is that creativity comes from observing the world, interpreting it, and bringing new concepts and new ideas. In other words, adding humanity, which is not something a machine is ever going to be able to do. So in that sense, AI enhances human ingenuity. For example, we're seeing some exciting advances in healthcare, where AI is being used more and more in surgeries to monitor and alert doctors throughout the operation to keep patients safe and to improve surgery outcomes. And this is just the start. AI will be used more and more pervasively to more quickly and accurately diagnose disease. Drug advances will be more efficient and accelerated. And some of the ambitions in telemedicine and telehealth really are quite exciting. In terms of transportation, a number of the largest car manufacturers globally are working on advancing the autonomous vehicle, really for wide-scale use. Now, would we have ever imagined that growing up? Look, probably not. But we're also seeing advances in sustaining the world around us, Even if you take our organization, Microsoft's investing $115 million in our AI for Good initiative, which provides funding and technology to not-for-profits and organizations who are tackling some of the biggest societal and environmental challenges, really to aid in humanitarian efforts and accessibility. And look, these are just a few examples. The possibilities are truly incredible. We can teach and use AI to do creative problem solving if we can harness and use the tech responsibly. And I think that's a little of what you were alluding to as well, Ian.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you very much, Andrea. I think that's certainly a very comprehensive overview of the sort of applications that we can expect to see AI in our everyday lives and also into the future. I'm not sure that too many people in Australia will be all that greater fans of Cricket Australia's rotation policy after how it went last time. But look, before we move on, congratulations on all you've achieved in your career as well. To become one of JCU's first female engineering graduates and find yourself really working at the forefront of one of what has to be said the 21st century's mightiest companies is a credit to you and certainly what our alumni can achieve. So Bill, I'll cross to you now. You do admit to not being an expert in this field, but you have been an informed witness to many chapters of human history. And in terms of technology, perhaps the greatest age of acceleration that we've ever seen. With that in mind, I would be interested in your views about some of the key issues in this field for us to explore further, drawing on the expertise of Andrea and Ian and our audience.
Yeah, thanks, Jack, very much. I think Andrea has identified at least two areas of expertise I do have, one being coffee and one being beer. My oldest son is in fact head brewer at Four Pines Brewery, so he's got good bloodlines, that lad. So look, yes, I mean, I've had a working life now of half a century. It's a shuddering thought, isn't it? But so I started at James Cook University in 1970, working full time, and had 40 years in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And then since early 2016, I've been here. So, you know, as you'd expect, I've seen an enormous advance in what technology means in our lives. You know, the sorts of things that we take for granted now, you know, the internet. I remember how huge computers were when I was punching out little chads in my Fortran programming days. You know, it's quite extraordinary. And the emergence of the internet, it of course, and we're not here to discuss this, but it had an enormous impact on the world of diplomacy as well. You know, things going back slowly by sea bag or air bag and coming back in the fullness of time with an answer. Now you need to, you know, you're expected to be producing reports of some pith and moment very, very quickly. So all these innovations, I think, have brought very significant social, economic, and political disruption. That's a truism, and for good but also for evil. I really think that some of what I just heard from Andrea is worth taking further on that, because I think that is so overwhelmingly possible. But we'll come back to this later. But so who modulates the worst excesses of this is something that perhaps we'll return to later. The first point I'd want to make too is, in case Ian is too modest to make it, is that the world of AI is not a foreign one to JCU. And in 2017, we established the narrowband Internet of Things laboratory on our campus up in Cairns, and it was a first for Australia. And I won't dare try to describe what I think is so wonderful about the Internet of Things to somebody who knows it so intimately. But I want to do make that point, that we have a university which was onto this very quickly. So to go to your question, really, I'd be interested to explore tonight some of the things that were already very eloquently been touched upon by the other two, and some of what you might perhaps call the socio-economic implications and conundrums of developments in AI and the related technologies. The ones that occur to me as a rank amateur is, you know, the positive impact of AI in performing some of those really important roles that are too dangerous for humans. You know, you've seen that with bomb diffusing, firefighting, all sorts of things, you know, sussing out danger in a hostage situation by using machines rather than human beings, with all the dangers and flaws of that. The impact of wider use of AI on the lower income portions of the global workforce. Now, I think that's interesting to unpack because the simple answer seems to be a shock horror. But, you know, when people could no longer ply their trade in putting shoes on horses, we moved into another age, and machines displacing human beings was the sort of thing that I lived with public anxiety about. Well, did that happen or did it not? So all that so-called displacement stuff, the potential impact, I think, on the international financial system, the international trade in goods and services too, the international marketplace, what it means for that. And, you know, some work that we're doing through Associate Professor Gunther Paul and some of his colleagues on the implications of driverless vehicles. Having clanged the mirror on my car yesterday morning, I've got a particular interest in handing all that over to something that's a whole lot more convenient and efficient than I am. So look, that touches the surface of it. I wouldn't pretend to have a lot of knowledgeable questions, but I think there's so many implications here that I'm really interested to explore.
Fantastic, Bill. And look, I think there was two just at the end there that you mentioned in terms of AI's role in our you know, financial trading around the world, and also the potential existential threat to humanity. I really would like to move on to Ian and sort of get his thoughts on those. You know, so Ian, moving on to you, you know, many authors, and I would say, you know, that also outside of science fiction, have spoken about the potential existential threat to humanity which artificial intelligence poses. So in prefacing my question, I'd like to return to the example that you raised earlier of Google's AlphaZero, absolutely blowing the leading machine champion out of the park in chess. Using machine learning principles, it learnt chess from scratch in just 4 hours. And to quote James Bridle, for centuries, chess was considered one of the crowning glories of human intelligence. And AlphaZero went from utter ignorance to creative mastery in just 4 hours without the help of any human guide. In October 2018, as Bill was alluding to before, computer algorithms control more financial trading around the world than human investors. So clearly we're placing more and more of our lives into the hands of AI. And more contemporary forms of machine learning, as you mentioned before, Ian, appear to be developing a greater sense of independent creativity. So it begs the question, will artificial forms of intelligence ever be competitors to the wise man that is our species?
Yeah, there's so much in that. So I'll just go back because I actually gave a talk on this. You know, in about 1994, I think checkers could be, the best human checkers players could be defeated by a machine. It was University of Calgary. And about a year or two later, IBM came along with their Deep Blue machine and astonishingly beat the grandmasters in chess. I think it was Garry Kasparov. And I had the same sort of computer on my desktop, actually, at the time, an IBM SP2 machine, IBM Power machine. It seemed incredible, really. But that was a moment, you know, that was coming. But there was a long lag. And as I said, described before, some new techniques came. They were not AI approaches. But then Google kind of dropped about 10 to the 71 combinations actually in Go. And it was vastly more complex compared to the 10 to the 30 odd for chess. And yet it used this approach where it fought each other and taught itself how to play this game. And it, not just that, but it came up with new strategies. The strategies that it used to win that game were not strategies that were known before. So that is a form of creativity, I guess, or it's just that humans are caught in some kind of local and didn't step outside it. The machine stepped outside it. And then Microsoft a year later could win a game of poker, which had slightly fewer combinations, but it used emotions. You know, it had to actually understand who was bluffing and who wasn't, which is astonishing when you sit back and think about it. Right? But then we know, I mean, many of us have seen these very early computer, I guess, chatbots. Eliza was one of them. It was one that, Bill, you would have played on, that early digital computer that you would have played with. And in fact, beyond Blue now, and I think a number of the mental health authorities actually using rather more advanced but AI-driven chatbots to actually provide mental health support and do it very successfully. And so there's something about our brain that will accept support from an AI chatbot over a computer typing better than face-to-face, or it's at least as an acceptable alternative, which is astonishing. So I think what this does is it opens up questions about ourselves that are rather uncomfortable because, you know, natively growing up, we believe we're superior. We're the master species on the planet, and we clearly are. We're in the Anthropocene, but we're maybe not as smart as we think. So creativity in computers is a topic that goes back since Alan Turing. And while I think they can amplify our creativity in our work practice and maybe art, actually, very interestingly, and music, and they can mimic us, and they can certainly write music that we find just completely acceptable. Is it the same? You know, provenance matters. I mean, you can get a Van Gogh that's stroke for stroke perfect as a copy, and is it as valuable as the Van Gogh? You know, the copy is thrown away. It's worth nothing but the Van Gogh. So that's a value that we humans put on it. Doesn't mean it's not the same. It just means we value it differently. So this very quickly gets to be very difficult set of problems that go beyond technology and go to our relationship with technology and our relationship with machines. So, you know, Bill used the example of the horse earlier, that, you know, when horseshoes were, when we went out of, when we stopped using horses, you know, where would the farriers go? And they got jobs like pumping fuel, being mechanics. That's true. Everyone says this time's different. I think this time is different because I think, as I've said before, the machines can do a lot of what we do for work. So what exactly will we replace it with? These, you know, perhaps more valued or higher activities, I mean, they're pretty complicated. And well, look at this AI problem. These are university research ideas and military research ideas. Why did they become accessible? So accessible that we can run programs for school kids, which we've done using a $3 piece of hardware and a camera, and they can write a facial recognition program with that in a few lines of code. It's because the really big tech companies, and you know their names, Microsoft and Google, Amazon, they're all in there. They put thousands of the smartest people you can imagine on these problems, and they put billions and billions of dollars into them in ways that we could never do in the public sector. And they've solved them, and they've solved them to solve their commercial problems and to put them out to the world. So it really comes down to something, I think one of the panelists, I can't recall who, talked about, maybe perhaps Bill, who controls this? You know, I kind of worry, and I used the example of the kids that we teach facial recognition to. I mean, that to me is like carrying around a nuclear bomb in their pocket. It's not the same. It's not going to blow up the world, but in another way, it could be even more powerful. So we've gone, if you're here in 10 years, where does the next decade look? So when I reach Bill's age, what does that world look like? And I think these are really amazing questions. So technology does great stuff, but I want humans to be in control of the technology.
So Ian, just on that, that's probably a good little segue for my next question to Andrea. So you did mention about Deep Blue as well. So that was actually in the year that I was born, which wasn't all that long ago.
No.
So in case anyone was wondering.
Enough with all this age stuff, please.
Yeah, you're making us feel really old, Jack.
Apologies for that. But look, you know, Deep Blue was actually the 259th most powerful computer in the world at that time. And it faced off against, you know, as Ian said, the greatest chess player in the history of the game, of the sport. And it was capable of analyzing more than 200 million board positions per second. So that's 1 billion moves in the time it took me to complete this last sentence. And, you know, poor Gary Kasparov was not outthought, but simply outgunned. And, you know, Google's AlphaZero would make that machine look utterly pedestrian. So, Andrea, I'd like to just come to you now. I understand you're a very keen advocate for AI and the opportunities that it heralds for us, and quite rightly so. But I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on some of the things that Ian just brought up. And also, you know, moving forward in the decades, as Ian said, what do you perceive the role of the humble human brain being in a world whose conscience is increasingly being placed into the hands of AI? And so let's look at 2050. By then, what sort of jobs are we doing, and what sort of value are we adding, and what sort of daily activities do we get up to?
Look, there's no doubt that there are our organization and other organizations who are really looking to democratize technology to be able to ensure that more people around the world are empowered and can use that technology, right? That's the positive side of organizations like ours spending these, multi-billions of dollars to really advance research. And there's also no denying that human ingenuity, it's amazing, let's face it. And technologies like AI have been invented to really build on that human ingenuity. At the end of the day, machine learning and automation, they're really just that, machine learning and automation. And the reality is, as tech does advance, some of the roles and the activities that exist today may not exist in the future, or technology may be able to do more efficiently, faster, better. I think if you look back over history, we've seen with every industrial revolution, it's resulted in humanity learning new skills to adapt and to contribute really accordingly. And that goes back to, Bill's example earlier of the horseshoes. And look, that's exactly what we're seeing today. With the move to cloud and to AI, it means we actually need more people who can code. We need more people who can program. We need more people who can develop technology. And that's why digital and STEM skills are really so important, not just for the kids in school, but for people like us as well. More than ever, we're seeing that technology is becoming a multidisciplinary sport. And if you look at where technology is going, anyone who majors in computer science or data science also needs to have a grounding in other disciplines, like liberal arts, for example. And similarly, students studying non-tech courses, like liberal arts, commerce, need to have some exposure to computer science and to data science. We need to recognize that teams who are going to solve some of the world's greatest problems using tech, well, they'll most likely be multidisciplinary teams. So with people who have different expertise and who come from different backgrounds. And in many organizations, look, even today, we're already seeing how roles are evolving to embrace technology and to drive innovation. Take an organization like Telstra. Everybody knows Telstra. When a Telstra field worker goes to a customer's home or the office, right? They need to have all the information at their fingertips to rectify the issue or to set up the service. Years ago, remember, they would have come out with their binders, their pad, their pen. Maybe they were to help on the day. Maybe they had to go away. Maybe they had to come back again, maybe a second, third, or fourth time. But today, Telstra's doing just that. They're reskilling, they're equipping their field workers to be able to better serve their customers in their home or their office by using technology, by leveraging technology. And look, there's really no limits to what people can learn, when they can learn, and what they can achieve at any age. I know we've talked a lot about these supercomputers. There's a really great example in Japan, where there's an 84-year-old lady who learned coding to create an online game for seniors because there wasn't one available at the tender age of 84. So take that as an example, just imagine what we can do. And I think, as Ian said, earlier, what does it really come down to? It is a pretty extraordinary time to be alive when you consider everything happening around us.
Fantastic. Yeah, look, I certainly agree. And it's great to hear that, you mentioned before about democratizing technology as well, Andrea, and I was really impressed to hear you speak about, anyone in this field certainly has to have a grounding in those sort of social and socioeconomic, fields that Bill was mentioning before. So Bill, I will cross to you now, just in keeping with what I asked Andrea in terms of the role of the human mind in 2050. I'd like to bring that sort of conversation to the right here and right now. You and I were talking off air, I think maybe a couple of days ago, about the potential for AI to influence our fundamental ability to develop thoughts, opinions, and value and values, and just how that might impact our society more broadly. So would you like to share those thoughts with the audience and also the other panelists? Oh, you'll have to jump off mute there, Bill.
You too. Thank you very much, Jack, and thank you, Andrea, for bringing in an 84-year-old. I feel all of a sudden a lot better. There is hope, apparently. So look, there's a lot here, I think. I'm really fascinated by some of these questions, like, you know, in the role I'm in now as a Chancellor, what might be the impact on AI of how we will in the future train and use our minds? I think it's a very important point that Andrea has made about the multidisciplinary approach in teams and so forth, if I understood that correctly. But if more and more processing and more processing, is done by that's traditionally been done by the human brain, and more is entrusted to greater reliance on much more efficient machines, that is liberating potentially, and I think that's terrific. But what does it mean for how we train the workforce of the future? I think that's an interesting one. What are the dangers if in, as it were, surrendering a great deal of our intelligence, creativity, and development of opinions and values to AI? And I think we've touched on that very, I think, reassuringly in some of the comments already. I think, as mentioned earlier, the majority of us now spend a great deal of time in some form of social media, which is fed by algorithms. I log on and I get all this stuff about the Arsenal Football Club. I get all sorts of things about Donald Trump for a different reason altogether. You know, so what are this danger of the potential difficulty of forcing us into echo chambers where we're thinking, yeah, look, at the rest of the world thinks like I do. You don't have to look too far away to events that culminate on the 3rd of November to realise just how dangerous some of that can be. So that thing, and the potential of that to fuel polarisation, and if these dangers are indeed real, what's the best means of combating the negative effects of that? I think it's beyond dispute that AI can be a great enabler. Where are the limits? And who, for example, regulates these things? We're seeing, even in so-called major democracies, that power of regulation, power of governance can be used extremely cynically and perversely. So where are the dangers? Where do we get this balance? I think is a fascinating issue, but also, I guess, as a Chancellor of our university, what does this mean for how we train the future workforce, both technically and ethically?
Excellent. Yeah, look, I think there's, it's good to see, Bill, that some of those thoughts that you were looking to have raised were answered earlier. So, look, we are entering probably into the last third of our session now. So I really would like to spend a bit of time talking to Andrea and Ian, really doubling down on the key theme, which Bill was mentioning, which is, of course, what life looks like with the increasing prevalence of AI and also the Internet of Things. So, Ian, I'll look to you first. One of the central themes of your research portfolio is the interrelationship between the physical and virtual worlds. So socially, politically, economically, and personally, how do you foresee our physical world being most profoundly altered by the latest innovations in the virtual space? And I think Bill certainly laid a nice, sowed some seeds to be answered there.
Yeah, it's a beautiful segue. Thank you, Bill. So, you know, I first got interested in what we call cyber infrastructure about 20 years ago. And I was at a conference in San Diego and, you know, the crucible of all of this stuff. And I was interested to see how people were using sensors on roads to create smart roads and how they could monitor the health of roads in real time. And then I walked down the road to Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and anyway, came back with the idea that we'd create a sensor network across the Barrier Reef, because the Barrier Reef is, you know, 2,800 kilometers, it's the size of Italy, and we had half a dozen scientists in boats, and how could you monitor this wretched thing? So, and then the idea of it was also democratization, that I didn't want to build expensive things. I wanted to take commodity, cheap, available stuff, so, and have thousands of devices rather than a few devices. And with the net, you know, the goal of actually creating citizen science project.
Cool. We seem to have lost Ian temporarily there.
With the year of sensors, everyone else will see the world like I does, and this will be it. but that didn't happen. And then suddenly, 5 or 6 years ago, I woke up and the big companies had got a hold of it. The idea of very low cost devices, you know, the technology prices had come down. We could buy CPUs for $3. We could put them everywhere. The networks were more affordable. And so now we had this idea of a smart city, and I fell in love with it, that a city that would sense itself like an operating system, and it would empty the bins when you need it. It would optimize energy. It would optimize water. We could preserve resources and improve people's quality of life. And then I was at a conference and saw someone from Chicago where they were using microphones on streetlights to triangulate gunshots so they know who'd been shot and where. And I thought, you know, is this really such a good idea? And then, of course, we entered this world of total surveillance and facial recognition. And this was a good idea that I hadn't really thought through the social implications and how it would be used by commerce and government. And so now we find ourselves in a world where IoT, which I think is incredibly powerful, is being turned into something where I think people are losing trust in it. Because, you know, and Andrea's in Singapore, which is the smartest smart city in the world in terms of its adoption of the tools and technologies. But in other societies, it's not happening in quite the same way. So another thing that's happening with this is, as Bill said, we're being atomized. Your social media feed is controlling what you see on screen and on Netflix. But soon it's going to define what the billboard is. It's actually happening now. As we walk past a billboard, you know, the Bluetooth from my phone talks to it, and I get an ad for things that'll be sold to me, and you'll walk by and you'll get a different thing. And all of a sudden, our physical world is different from each other too. So where does that lead us? Where does it mean where we occupy the same physical space and we don't feel the same physical space? And I think one of the things we're learning, and it's again what Bill was comes to the point Bill was talking about, that it actually fractures us. We don't have a commons anymore, a uniform space. So I think one of the things we need to do with technology is recreate commons where the algorithm doesn't filter out the worst of it. And I think the only way I can think to do that is we remove anonymity. Anonymity has been fantastic, but it also now reveals the worst of us. And I might leave it at that around that point. But I think we really have to think about the data that we give away about ourselves. We've got to think about what AR will do, virtual reality will do. Will we eventually withdraw to a world where we create a nice world around us and we sit inside our space just looking at the nice things which are computer generated? So these dark futures exist in parallel with the really optimistic futures. And we have to make the right choices. We can't sleepwalk into this. I think this is the very future of society and democracy and humanity. This is why it's a pivotal moment. It won't play out for 100 years. We'll be gone. But what we do now is setting the foundations. And just one final thing, I'm taking too much time, but Bill and Andrea, you started it. We've got to have a new sort of graduate. We've got to have a generalist. We've got to have tech. We've got to have columns, but with this breadth of understanding, we've got to have everyone being able to have an interesting conversation with everyone else around every topic. We need to rethink education all the way through because the world is now different. It may not involve 12 years of school. It may involve 20, it may involve 2, I don't know. But we need to do something new.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it certainly is the age of the generalist. And I was very interested to hear that you raised the point of the sort of surveillance world that we live in. Yuval Noah Harari, one of the 21st century's leading historians, actually named that, immediately identified that as one of his greatest concerns of what COVID had done, obviously with tracking infections and whatnot. Look, we are running out of time here, so I will move on to Andrea. We've actually had a question from the audience around the concern for equity in regards to artificial intelligence. And so that was a question that I had for you as well. So look, in our last session, Andrea, we spoke about bridging rising inequalities around the world. And there's no doubt in my mind that AI is going to have an influence on that one way or another. So as such, what role do you see the tech giants such as Microsoft, Google, Apple, and so on really playing in ensuring that the development of the next great technological achievements are undertaken with a concern for ethics and equity, just like we've mentioned throughout this session?
So first of all, thanks to the attendee for putting up that question. Incredibly relevant and really topical. Our fundamental responsibility really as humanity is, if you think about it, it's in making the world safe, more inclusive, and really accessible to everybody. Whether you're a business leader, a school teacher, a student, a small business owner, a parent even. And in this case, fundamentally, what we're talking about is actually endowing machines with the ability to make some decisions that previously could only be made by humans. And this is where we have to ask ourselves, what kind of decisions do we want machines to be able to make? And if we have any aspiration really for these decisions to reflect the best of humanity, then we need to focus on responsibility and all of the elements really surrounding that. And ethics plays a fundamental role here, just as Bill rightly called out. So a good place to start is ensuring that principles are used to guide us into the future, to underpin what we call responsible AI. So at our organisation, we've outlined 6 core principles that we really believe are fundamental. And the first is fairness, or the avoidance of bias. And Bill, you touched on that a little earlier as well. Second is the need to protect privacy and security. Ian, you touched on that. And if you think about the different generations, perhaps what we may share as, Gen X might actually be pretty different to what the millennial generation might be comfortable sharing. We also need to ensure that AI is safe and reliable for anyone that uses it, be it the 84-year-old through to our children. And AI also needs to be inclusive of everyone on the planet, and particularly the 1 billion people who have some form of disability, many of which aren't visible. And there also needs to be transparency so that people can have the confidence in the fulfillment of these principles. And last is accountability, which really is the bedrock. And I think, Bill and Ian, you've both touched on this at various points in your comments as well. Machines must be accountable to people. And the principle is that people who create this technology must remain accountable to society. But the biggest challenge really for any organisation today is to take the commitment to these principles and then turn them into something that's real every day. So how do we bring them to life?
Yeah, excellent. And look, we do have some questions. I'm just looking at the Q&A that have flowed through. So Ian, just quickly, we do have one for you from Sue Meek. And she's asked if you could please expand on your comment about removing anonymity, given how easily those who wish to disguise themselves can do so. So she used the example of Russian, Chinese, and bots.
Well, I mean, that's kind of a good reason that we need a human behind. So look, there's been various proposals where you need to authenticate in some way to get onto the internet. And so that it would guarantee that there's a human there and it may be traceable. So, you think about the worst of activity on the internet, it's all to do with the fact that you can be anonymous. Now, this is very controversial because it would take away some of the positives of the internet, some of the democratization, but I still think at some levels in social media, we need to have more accountability. And it's not just, certainly the vendors need accountability, and it's really so super challenging. But at the beginning of the internet, for those that can remember those days, the anonymity was something that was fantastic about it. But now, what have we done with it? Have we done the best of it? Or have we have we made places that are in some cases extremely toxic? So it's a provocation, I guess, but I think we've got to think about it. But technically, it's possible. Technically, it's possible.
Yeah. And look, I think Michael in the audience has also put forward a bit of a thought here that I think, Bill, you and I have spoken about, and certainly the sessions mentioned as well. Michael's mentioned, is there a clear dividing line in the use of AI, such as robotics? A volunteer organisations such as Rotary may use AI to enhance its community services, but at the same time, religious fundamentalists or extreme political ideologies may use the same AI to advance its own agenda. And look, I think that's certainly what we're trying to explore in this session. I think we've all, come to the conclusion that technology needs a human dimension. And as Andrea said, that's why we need journalists, we need professionals in this sector that truly have an understanding of what's best for the advancement of society. So, look, it has been Bill, it's been a fantastic session. I'll just quickly turn to you. We've been privileged enough to hear from two genuinely expert alumni in the field, and I think it's been a fantastic session. However, I thought I would just come to you to hear any sort of closing remarks. Based on what Andrea and Ian have put forward today, do you perceive AI as some sort of savior to our problems as a species by having all the answers, or do you in fact think that it leaves us with more questions?
I think it's like fire, good servant, bad master. And I think another thing that we haven't touched upon, and we're running out of time, as inevitably we would, but one of the things I find very challenging about this is that at a time when you need, in the trust space, which I think Ian was talking about, in the trust space that is also fundamental to the sort of thing that Andrea was talking about in her most recent intervention, is the erosion of respect for genuine and deep expertise. One of the worst outcomes, I think, of the proliferation of things and the exploitation of it by unscrupulous people has been the erosion of the idea that genuine expertise and knowledge matters. So how do we insert back, how do we invert that process of having people deeply respectful at an important level, at a level which they require their representatives in those countries where they're privileged enough to be able to choose their representatives, to come back to a genuine respect for expertise, because that is the trust thing. I wouldn't have a clue about how to run a car engine, but I know that I can take it somewhere and trust somebody will do it pretty well if it breaks down. There's so much else in life that's the same. But when you have quite a flagrant effort to downplay the value of genuine and deep expertise, and it's not foreign in our own country, it's probably more and more rampant in our own country, you are on a dangerous slope. How do you arrest that?
Yeah, very interesting. I think that's certainly the question that we all get to, as living human beings in this age, we all get to live and breathe it into the future and see what happens. So thank you so much to all three of our esteemed alumni panelists, and especially to our two alumni who have taken the time to give our alumni community really interesting insight into a truly fascinating world dominated by AI and IoT and the virtual space. We live in a world now where some robots are fellow citizens, colleagues, and even life partners. And we live alongside AI in everything we do. So it really has been a privilege to hear your informed insights into some of humanity's greatest questions and challenges and opportunities. And so, in wishing you all the best for the future, this does conclude tonight's conversation with alumni panel session. I really hope our audience enjoyed it. And look, judging by the questions that have been streaming through, and I do apologise for having had the time to answer those, I think we can certainly see that it has been an engaging session. Our next event will be in late October, and we will be shifting the conversation to health challenges that we're facing the tropics right the way through to 2050. Our panelists will, of course, be alumni, and we look forward to announcing them to you in due course. In the meantime, stay up to date with all things alumni on our social media. And for those of you in the audience who are alumni, please visit our website. Make sure your details are up to date so that we can send you an invitation to our next Conversations with Alumni session. Thank you all for listening, and wherever you are around the world, we wish you, a JCU alumni family, many safe and happy returns during these trying times. Good night.